Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Payments Association and Paysafe on the future of payments for U.S. daily fantasy sports and sports betting. My name is Alia Mahmood. I am a Regulatory Affairs Practice Lead at Comply Advantage and also member of the Payments Association Financial Crime Working Group. And I am thrilled to be moderating today's webinar with our fantastic panelists. Now, before we get started and I introduce you to our speakers, I do want to run through a few quick bits on housekeeping. Now, we want today's session to be as interactive as possible and for you all to direct the conversation with your questions. So please do pop in your questions in the question and answer tab that you will see on the console. Feel free to drop in questions as and when the session is happening, and we'll pick them up when we see them. Now, you'll also notice a chat box. Now, the chat box is great if you would like to discuss things amongst yourselves. Please also let us know where you are joining us from around the world, but please only submit questions in the question and answer box because it means that we can look at them quicker than if you submit them in the chat box. Now, before I waste any more time, I'm very excited to introduce you to our speakers. Today, I am joined by Greg Kirstein. He's the General Manager of North America for Paysafe, and I'm also joined by Mike Robleski, VP of Payments and Fraud at PrizePick. What I'd love to do is for you both to introduce yourselves, and Greg, I will start with you.
Thanks for the introduction, Alia. Nice to meet everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. As Alia mentioned, Greg Kirstein, I oversee Paysafe's North American online gambling business. I've been with the company just over 10 and a half years. So starting in 2013, which was a very transformational time for the industry, which included the regulation of online poker and casino in the first three states of Delaware, New Jersey, and Nevada. And was also a very interesting time when I met Mike, when the emergence of daily fantasy sports and the critical role they have played in the proliferation of online gaming in the US. So great to meet everybody. Looking forward to today's discussion, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg. Mike Robleski, Vice President of Payments and Fraud at PrizePicks. I've been in the gaming industry since in the US since 2004. Had a prior cup of coffee back in the day with DraftKings here in the US. We did expand internationally before I left the industry in a similar role. Payments and fraud has been my background and foundation from the beginning. Started working with Paysafe back in 2014 when I met Greg. Really, my responsibilities in the space have been focused on, wallet efficiencies, fraud and chargeback detection and prevention, and essentially just helping grow both the DraftKings business from its infancy and now the PrizePicks business from its startup position to where it is today. So again, happy to be contributing today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you both. You both have a wealth of experience that you're going to be sharing with our viewers today. Now, we've got a lot of topics to discuss, and we've broken it down into 4 key areas. So I do just want to give you an overview of what to expect from today's session. And like I said before, it's an open dialogue. So please do feel free to drop in question and answers. And don't be shy, because you can also submit them anonymously if you wish to do so. Now, the first segment we're going to start off with is around the regulatory landscape of daily fantasy sports and real money sports betting in the US. And particularly, what are the challenges that operators are surmounting when it comes to the payments? Now, our second theme is on payments and the different types of payment preferences that are being offered by daily fantasy sports and sports bettors, and also the different customer segments. So you have your casual players and your VIP high rollers. And different payment preferences can dictate what customers prefer and also impact customer acquisition, retention, and the overall growth. Now, this third segment that we'll be going into is how operators approach payment security, because gaming should be fair, safe, and secure for users, but you also want to ensure that seamless experience for players, as well as balancing the security around sensitive financial information. And finally, because this is a booming industry, we're going to talk about the potential of future technological developments in this space for sports betting, and also the impact that future technological innovations could have on the customer experience. So let's jump straight in. And I'm going to start with you, Greg, if that's okay. I'd love for you to paint a picture of the regulatory landscape.
Yeah, so the regulatory landscape is actually very different between, regulated online gaming or sports betting in the US and daily fantasy sports. And, going into that, the best place to start is in 2006 when UIGEA was passed in the US. It banned, all internet gambling companies from operating legally in the United States, but there was an important carve out in those regulations, which set the stage for the DFS boom that started in 2012, in which games of skill were carved out of UIGEA. So in 2013, when you looked at the emergence of daily fantasy sports, they were able to offer safe, regulated a form of online gaming in the US because it was truly, in essence, a game of skill, whereas online gambling is a very different set of requirements. So when you look at the rise of DraftKings and FanDuel, it all kind of stemmed from that carve out in the initial set of regulations. And daily fantasy, and Mike maybe has the number off the top of his head, was available as a game of skill in close to 40 to 45 states in the US, where in 2013 was the first time where states were provided the opportunity to legislate online casino or poker within state boundaries. So you had early adopters like Delaware, New Jersey, and Nevada, and only patrons within that state had access to online poker and casino products, and it all had to be geo-fenced within those particular jurisdictions. Fast forward to 2018, the Supreme Court battle between the state of New Jersey to allow other states outside of Nevada to legislate and regulate online sports betting created the current online sports betting boom that the U.S. has been participating and enjoying over the last 6 years. So again, very different models. One is very clearly online gambling, which requires state regulators to legislate on a state-by-state basis. Whereas on the daily fantasy sports side, because it is a game of skill, it doesn't follow the same set of regulations, and it's available to most consumers across the country. But with the regulation of PASPA in 2018, we've also seen some states take the opportunity at the same time to regulate and license daily fantasy in some of those jurisdictions. So that kind of paints the picture in terms of its history in the US. And I'm sure Mike can speak, to how that impacts, him and his company as a daily fantasy sports operator.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So the deregulation as a result of UIGEA being repealed really left it up to the individual states to make their own decisions with regards to whether or not to allow daily fantasy sports and eventually sports betting to occur within their jurisdictions. Certainly, the daily fantasy sports segment is considered a game of skill. The sports betting segment is considered a game of chance. So with that comes different challenges. But in terms of from the operator's perspective, regardless of what sector you're working in, the best practices in terms of what's required to get approvals in individual states are very similar. So we like to follow best practices for the game of chance segment because those are strong requirements and really from a back end and from a fraud and payment perspective, they're better practices to as opposed to having looser practices on the daily fantasy sports side. So what I mean by that is our KYC or know your customer requirements are very similar to the sports gambling requirements. Our geolocation requirements are very similar, and our age verification, anti-money laundering requirements, fraud prevention and detection requirements are also very, very similar. We like to operate kind of on the same medium in those areas. And a lot of us, frankly, use the same partners as it relates to those key points. So what does that mean? In order for us to, well, so from a state perspective, we have to abide by the rules that they give us. Every single state has different regulations and requirements. So we abide by what they're telling us in terms of how we need to operate in those jurisdictions. From a payments perspective, it's very similar as well because in order to get approved by Visa, by MasterCard, to have partnerships with folks like PaySafe, we have to have everything aligned as it relates to knowing your customer. Are they who they say they are? Are they above age of 18 or 19 or 21, depending on which jurisdiction you're talking about? Are the users accessing from a geolocation that they are supposed to be accessing from and not playing via proxy? So there's a lot of nuance when it comes to that, but a lot of that stuff happens in the background, unbeknownst to the user whatsoever. As part of the onboarding process, when a user is providing us their name, their address, their payment information, we're taking that information, we're processing it against our internal databases, but also utilizing third-party partners to help us verify that people are who they say they are, they're the age that they're claiming to be, and they're located where they're supposed to be located. There's other nuances in terms of AML requirements, anti-money laundering requirements, as well as terrorist watch lists, things of that nature, politically exposed people. So a lot happens in the background very, very quickly as we're onboarding users. But the requirements are similar in the daily fantasy sports space as they are in the sports gambling space. And really, we believe at Prize Picks, it's in our best interest to have strong controls as it relates to those topics.
Yeah, and just to add one more point to that, just before we move on to the next subject, because also what's important to understand is the set of payment challenges for a daily fantasy sports operator historically compared to an online sports betting operator or casino or poker is the payment challenges are significant, are very different, very significant. So when I mentioned at the beginning that daily fantasy sports was able to proliferate across the US because it truly is a game of skill. A game of skill in the eyes of the card brands is very different than a regulated online casino or poker operator. So what that meant, and if you look at the construction of each of their individual cashiers, is games of skill or video arcade style games in the eyes of the card brands have a very high approval rate, right? So the challenges for daily fantasy sports companies as it relates to payments were very different than some of the early online casino and poker operators. So, I'm sure there's some people on this call that reside from Europe or the UK, and the global online merchant category code for online gambling is 7995. In the US, when New Jersey, Delaware, and Nevada regulated in 2013, they went with the global merchant category code at the time, which was 7995. But because of UIGA in 2006, every major issuer across the US just blacklisted 7995. So the approval rates on cards when the industry started was at like 20 to 30%, right? Or maybe even less. So the need for alternative payment methods to allow customers to fund the wallet were paramount. Then you flip to daily fantasy sports, which was growing in popularity, but because it had a different merchant category code, you had approval rates on credit and debit card that were near 95%, right? So the need for APMs was more of a nice to have than a critical component like the online gambling operator. So over time, it took a lot of time, and Paysafe and many of the first moving payment companies and Visa and MasterCard spent years trying to educate the issuers in the US around, hey, this isn't like illegal online offshore gambling. This is regulated, safe, geofenced, KYC'd customers that are trying to make deposits. So, the first move in changing that is the US is the only country, I believe, in the world that has a different merchant category code for regulated online gambling, which they introduced 7801. And this was for licensed, regulated online sportsbooks, casino operators, and poker operators. And that over time, as we continue to educate the banks, that has changed, right? Like today, online sports operators probably enjoy closer to an 85 to 90% approve rate on cards, but it was very different over the last 10 years. It took a lot of time to get there. So when you compare and contrast the challenges between daily fantasy and regulated online gaming, just from a pure payments perspective, they had very different journeys over the last 10 years to help with acceptance and retention and conversion on customers. So as we kind of go into some of that and unlock some of that in this discussion, it's just good to kind of have just to think about, because like I said, the journeys were very, very different from one industry to the other.
Thanks so much, Greg and Mike. And it's great to see how the industry has, adopted the payment processing to kind of meet these challenges, and just kind of staying on top of all the state-led legislation must be a minefield as well for your teams to tackle, to see what's coming on. Now, for players, having a quick withdrawal is important. They want to cash out their winnings or their funds. But are you seeing any challenges specifically, especially around fraud and financial crime, when it comes to quick withdrawals? Because although it's important, there needs to be controls in place as well. So, Mike, I'll start with you, if that's okay on this one.
Sure. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We want to process withdrawals as quickly and as efficiently as possible, but we also have to measure and weigh the risk of processing withdrawals as quickly and as efficiently as possible, right? So the user experience is very important. One of the, if not the most popular inquiry that we receive from our users in the industry is, how do I withdraw my funds? Where are my funds going to land? And how long is it going to take for me to get my funds? And so we're very, very keen to those concerns on our users' behalf. And of course, we want to provide the best user experience as possible. That being said, we can't just process withdrawals without due diligence, right? And so we utilize a number of different things in order to quickly, efficiently, but safely process withdrawals. We have internal processes in terms of our staff monitoring withdrawals, approving withdrawals, and really making sure that we have our eyes on these withdrawal requests, and we process them, as quickly as we can, while maintaining the appropriate level of due diligence internally. We also rely on our partners at Paysafe and our other partners in terms of their back-end systems to help us identify potential bad actors. Now, this also aligns with, what we're doing to onboard users, right? So like when we're onboarding users and we're trying to identify them from a know your customer and an age and an anti-money laundering and a geolocation perspective, like we spoke of in point one, that's a big part of the entire process, including the withdrawal process, right? So like if we're concerned about bad actors on the back end with withdrawals, and we run into a problem on that back end in terms of sending out funds that shouldn't have been sent, the first thing that I do is I start to think about, okay, well, what happened when that user was onboarded? Was that user KYC'd appropriately? Did we miss something? We're pretty good at these things, and it's been kind of an evolution over the course of the last 10 years or so. And I think all of the partners in the space, whether it's been daily fantasy sports or sports wagering in the United States, have become better at this um, overall. But we all kind of do it a little differently, but the overall approach, I think, is the same. There's a lot of internal um, review that takes place in order for us to protect ourselves and to protect our consumers and to also provide a positive user experience. But we're also relying upon um, our payment partners to help us in that mission as well. And so I'll hand it to Greg, and maybe he can talk a little bit about what they do on the PaySafe side, not only in terms of the withdrawal piece, but perhaps Greg, you could talk a little bit about what you guys do on the front end when it comes to us utilizing your fraud filters and things of that nature.
Yeah, and I think, and I saw someone ask a question around, what payment companies are doing to increase security. So I think this falls right into that. So, one of the biggest things, if we look at just withdrawals for a second, just once we're on that note, then we'll move to the front end. For us, it comes down to data, right? It's the more data we can arm our operators and merchants with, the more data they have to make a sound decision around the legitimacy of that actual withdrawal, right? So as Mike said, they have a lot of safeguards in place and many different reviews that they do internally before they send out a withdrawal. But for us, it's arming them with data, right? It's, also there's fraud rules on the back end. How many times do we see this particular customer withdrawing on a daily basis or weekly basis? So I think for payment providers, the biggest thing that we do, especially on withdrawals, is the amount of data that we can provide, right? Like also things like, and we see it becoming a more common theme in some of the US states, is can we verify for sure that, for example, the bank account, let's just say it's ACH, it's the bank account on file is actually belongs to the customer that is requesting the withdrawal, right? So, if we see it's coming from a different name, that's data that we can provide, Mike and his team to do more due diligence and maybe ask for more before they send that withdrawal. When you look at on the card side and pushing winnings to cards, it comes down to more data, right? Like Visa, for example, and MasterCard are releasing tools this year, called account naming verification. Maybe I'm butchering it or the acronym, but it's things that we are putting into our systems on the card side to make sure that we can match the actual name on the card to the name of the actual financial institution. In previous years, like that wasn't possible, right? Like you can never get that information back from the issuer. Visa and MasterCard, again, because of the emergence of fraud and security, are providing payment providers with more tools to arm their operators with. Then you look at things on the front end, right? There's tons of risk rules and key features that we offer our merchants, right? Things like velocity checks, risk scoring, how risky do we think a transaction is? Do we know this customer? Are they a repeat depositor? Are they a net new customer? So, that's again more data that we're providing on our to our operators to make sound decisions. Listen, you always want to find the balance between making sure that you're keeping bad actors and bad transactions off the platform, but not limiting good and clean traffic to enter into the platform, right? So there's always, you don't want to create false positives or kill conversions, because as a payment provider, we also very much appreciate that our customers spend quite amount of money to acquire customers, and we want to make sure that we're providing them with sound solutions to help acquire that customer and turn them into a transacting customer. But for us, it comes down to working with our merchants to find out where they're akin to fraud. If there's a fraud ring, like how do we make sure that we stop deposits after 1 or 2 tries within a set period of time, or an email address maybe being used 1 or maximum 3 times in a given day. Like, these are just examples, but there's a plethora of different tools that they can leverage to our platform that can help limit bad transactions from entering the platform and making sure we're letting good transactions through. There's also things that we do that are mandated and regulated by some of the states, right? That are within their regs around payments. To take the UK, for example, to use a good example, like a couple of years ago, the UK banned operators from accepting credit cards as a deposit method in the for online gambling, right? They didn't want consumers to gamble on credit. It also ties back to responsible gaming. So in the US, you've seen some states and even some states take that same approach. They want their customers to gamble with funds that they actually have, right? So what we do for our operators on a state-by-state basis, we have different accounts on a state level. We have the ability to block credit cards on the front end. So, we have bin lists that we update on a daily basis to make sure that, no customer using a credit card can, fund their wallet with a credit card. We block that on the front end. You look at states like New York, who have taken a different approach where they only allow consumers to deposit up to $2,500 a month using a credit card. So we have to help track that and monitor that on a customer basis and relay that information back to our customers. So there's a multitude of different things that we can do. And if you look at the question that was asked, I think it really comes down to data, having as many risk rules, risk tools, and data as possible to arm our customers with as much information they can to make sound, good decisions on payments.
Yeah, let me jump into just to add, from the operator's perspective, we certainly receive a lot of consumer data from our users, but it's just what we receive directly from our user base. It's really important for the operators to be utilizing and leveraging the tools of their payment providers, because a company like Paysafe, for example, processes, millions and millions and millions of transactions across several verticals. We're only seeing what comes to us directly from our consumers. And so, our payment providers are seeing transactions from all over and several different verticals. And so they can provide us with a lot more data and give us a lot more information that we would be able to utilize and leverage to make decisions. So that's an important point.
Exactly. Like, because we play across so many different verticals, like Mike said, like we have tools like a negative database. For example, if there's a bunch of customers that are going out and trying to fraud DraftKings, for example, and those customers initiate chargebacks, we have those card numbers and those names in the negative database. So if they go try to make the same deposit at PrizePicks, we'll prevent those transactions outright, or at least put them into a challenge state where Mike and team can kind of do extra due diligence to see if they want to let those customers through. So there's many different ways to do it. And just to touch on one more piece, because we've mostly been focused on fraud, on the security standpoint, I mean, we see data breaches in many different verticals and industries all the time. We saw one big one in our industry recently with a very high profile operator. As a payment provider too, our customers, in most cases, are not fully PCI compliant, right? We manage a lot of those that information and store sensitive credit card and personal information in our database where our merchants don't touch it, right? So we have solutions that, again, are fully PCI level 1 compliant. Things like hosted fields, where it kind of looks and feels like, PrizePicks, for example, is hosting the actual experience, but Paysafe is actually hosting the sensitive player details around cards and and names, and we're sending those tokens back to Mike and team through API calls. Don't want to get overly technical, but there's a lot of things that we do on the security side too that help safeguard consumer and player information.
Thanks so much, Greg and Mike. It's very much a partnership that's needed between the payment service providers and the operators, almost symbiotic in a way. It's the data that then informs the operator on the risks of their players that might present. Now, Mike, I want to keep on the topic of fraud for a second, for our next segment, and have our viewers understand a bit more about those back-end controls that can help combat and prevent fraud. Now, I really loved what you said earlier on when you said when you do identify risks when it comes to the payout stage, it makes you think about what was the onboarding of a customer. So, of course, everything is linked into that, you know, the entire customer journey is linked. But from a back-end perspective specifically, what are the types of things that other operators should think about when it comes to combating fraud?
Really, it's a know your customer approach. How long has that customer been with us? What is our relationship with that customer? How many contests have that customer has that customer entered? How many deposits have they made? How many withdrawals have they made? Is this withdrawal going out and heading to the same location that previous withdrawals have been processed to? How much is the withdrawal, right? A very important piece. You know, clearly, the larger the withdrawal request, the more scrutiny it should receive. And so, you know, all of those factors, if it's a new user who is coming to us very quickly and makes a large deposit and doesn't participate in very many contests and then suddenly tries to withdraw a lot of those funds initially without any real activity, red flags should be going up all over the place. So that's really kind of our approach, is that we develop internal filters and flags where if certain our job really from a fraud perspective is trying to identify anomalous activity, right? And so if something looks wrong, it's time to slow it down. That particular request, not everybody's, right? To Greg's point, we don't want to slow down good traffic. So we identify specific anomalous activity and we slow that down and we take a closer look. And we have a number of different tools and platforms that we leverage in order to get a better idea of who this user is, how long they've been with us, are they who they say they are, and is this withdrawal heading to where it's supposed to be? So there's a lot of factors, but it's really a layered approach that starts when the user registers with their email address, creates a password. Like, have we seen that password before? Have we seen that email address before? Then the user proceeds to give us, you know, their name, their address, their payment methods. Is any of this identifiable to us? Have we seen it in the past? Has it been related in any way to a bad actor before? Their device identification information is scrutinized. Then what happens to those funds in our ecosystem? How are they playing? Are they playing? The method in which they're playing. And then finally, the withdrawal piece, right? So each one of those buckets get scrutinized in kind of a different way. But overall, it's really about the identification of anomalous activity, really.
Yeah, that's fantastic the way you put that, Mike. Thank you. It's essentially being able to verify risks at every single one of those touch points. And And I like the way the customer journey goes, where you can kind of use just an email address and a password to do initial kind of checks before you even get to the point of asking the customer for more information. I can imagine that reduces friction. Now, we do have a question, and I'll keep it with you, Mike, this one. So the question is there a concern of fraud or money laundering in head-to-head matchups, and how is this combated? For example, is there any tracking of lineups being set in head-to-head contests?
Yeah. Head-to-head contests create a different challenge and are certainly a different animal as it relates to public contests. Um, the exposure for money laundering and fraud in head-to-head contests is certainly higher than in a public contest. So to answer the question, there is more scrutiny given in those contests. There are um, additional filters that are built in order to try to identify users who, to use an industry term, maybe sandbagging their lineups, and meaning creating head-to-head contests where one user intentionally tries to lose to another user, thus funneling funds through our platform and then attempting to withdraw those funds. So there's a number of different things that we look at. That it's a totally different animal. So it requires additional and different types of scrutiny. But it's all certainly controllable. And again, it's really a question of, is this anomalous? So let me give you an example in the traditional kind of the daily fantasy sports version 1 from like a DraftKings FanDuel product type of perspective. If a user creates a lineup, and in that not to get too technical, but in that version of daily fantasy sports, you're given a salary cap of $50,000, and you have to go and choose players and keep your lineup under the salary cap. Well, if you choose a lineup and you don't use 50% of your salary cap, or you're choosing players that are not even playing or injured, these are things we're looking at. These are things we're looking for. And so we have filters set up that identify this type of anomalous activity for sure.
Fantastic. And before we move on to the next segment, Mike, I just want to stay with you for a second. A lot of the financial crime and fraud detection also comes around through the rules, like you said, the rules to monitor anomalous behavior, suspicious activity, anything that would seem out of the ordinary. But I'd love for the viewers to know whether those rules are segmented based on the different player types. So a casual player versus someone who's a high roller, VIP. Do you take a nuanced approach for the different customer segments?
Yeah, without a doubt. Certainly newer users get a closer look. Again, it comes back to, how long have you been with us? Who are you? Do we know you? Do we even have a personal relationship with you? Right? Like, we'll run events where our whales or highest revenue players will invite, and we'll meet them in person, right? And so, like, what is our relationship with that player? So depending on which, and every operator, at least that I've worked with, and I would recommend, has different segments of users, right? And so depending upon which segment you're in, we do create a nuanced approach and a different approach in terms of scrutiny, depending on like how long you've been with us, how much you've spent with us, do we know you, what's our relationship, and frankly, again, we rely upon a lot of device identification information, right? So geolocation information. So there's a lot to it. have we detected that, you're trying to utilize a VPN or Tor or some sort of alternative method to uh, mask where you're located. Like there's a lot to it. It's a layered approach, as I said earlier.
Yeah, and there's certainly key takeaways here that UK operators can definitely learn from. That's definitely been an area of struggle, and only today in the news, a UK gaming operator, GameSys, was fined £6 million for very simple AML failures. So any viewers in the UK, there are definitely best practices that we can take from the US. Now, moving on to our final segment, Greg, I'm going to start with you. Where is the industry heading when it comes to payments? And of course, when we're talking about where we're heading, it's very important to look at where we have come from and what the challenges were and what we've learned from those challenges going forward.
For sure. So at the beginning, and I kind of laid the foundation and the context for how different the payment acceptance challenges have been for both daily fantasy operators and regulated online gaming operators. So if you look at on the regulated sports betting, casino, and poker side, like the recap of the last 10 years, it was purely about conversion. It was, our customers and operators across the space were spending a lot of money to acquire customers, but every payment method on the cashier wasn't exactly, plain ball, for a lack of a better term. You had many different issuers across the US that still didn't understand these were safe, regulated online sports betting operators. So, for US consumers, the first thing that they'll always think to use is their credit and debit card. That's just consumer behavior in the US. So when these transactions would get declined, it was all about making sure that operators on the front end were able, and also through information that payment providers were giving them, to message to those customers, hey, your credit or your debit card, will not work because your issuer doesn't accept online gambling transactions. Why don't you try ACH or a prepaid card or a digital wallet? So being able to message that to customers in real time, because like I said earlier, we appreciate the fact that operators spend a lot of money to acquire customers. It's a very competitive space. So you need to make sure that you can get them through that funnel and turn them from an acquired customer to a transacting customer. So I think when you look at, like I said, the last 10 years of where we came from, so much of it was put on conversion, finding a way to get money through the funnel. When you fast forward to today, and you see that, like I said, most issuers across the US accept online gambling transactions, especially on debit cards. Today, there's a much more focus on efficiency and speed, right? The conversion issues, I wouldn't say they're fully behind us, but they're starting to, be in the rearview mirror. And now it just comes down to speed and conversion, right? I'll steal a line from one of my colleagues, right? In relation to Apple Pay, like, why would you go through any other payment method and enter in information where you can just look at your phone and Face ID and make a deposit directly into your account? So the emergence of faster ways to check out and get funds in, that's a huge thing. You even look at that and compare the contrast to online shopping, right? There's things like Shop Pay and Amazon Pay and Google Pay, just ways to expedite the checkout. And then you also look at the emergence of technologies, right? You look at things like ACH, which played a massively critical role and still continues to do so in online gaming. But the amount of time and fraud that can happen with that payment method is still high to a certain degree because, as an operator, you might be getting those funds instantly, but it still takes time for those funds to actually settle in the back end and come out of your account. So you look at the emergence in things in the US like RFP or RTP. In Europe, and I'm based in Canada, things like open banking are far more advanced than what they are in the US today, right? That's a place where the US is still behind. So if as an operator, you want to accept as many payment methods as possible where you're getting information back and funds are coming out of the account in real time, right? You're less akin to fraud. You don't need to rely maybe more on guaranteed type of solutions and taking on fraud that leads to a lot of returns in bad debt, as we call it in the industry. So I would say that, and then I would say that is probably like the biggest thing that operators are focused on today is really speed, efficiency, getting as much information back from their payment providers as possible, which also plays into the fraud conversation we had earlier. And then the emergence of local payment methods, right? We've seen, you look at a younger demographic of customers, they operate with Venmo, right? They don't use maybe old traditional payment methods. Venmo has become a pillar in the space now. Kind of younger demographic of customers using funds they have in their Venmo wallets to push funds into their wagering accounts. There's also a competitor that they have called Cash App. I'm sure we'll see Cash App play a role in the space as time goes on. They have, some better penetration in some states across the U.S. So I think, that is kind of where the industry is today, what the focus is on. I know everyone likes to talk about cryptocurrency and how we use crypto, but listen, it's no secret the amount of challenges that crypto has had, especially from a regulatory perspective in the US. Yes, it's cool. Yes, there's a lot of hype behind it, and I'm sure eventually there will be a safe way to use it as it relates to online gaming. But I still think we're pretty far away from that, especially with regulation in the US and how strict it is on a state by state level. It's if anything, we want more information, not less information. We don't want to anonymize transactions. So I still think there's a lot that has to happen there before we see it in a safe, regulated environment. But yeah, I would say, like I said, to recap, initially it was down to conversion, trying to get as many APMs on the platform. Now it really comes down to speed, efficiency, getting as much information back to make sound decisions, keeping bad transactions off the platform, and then the emergence of newer payment methods that we see that younger customers are using on a day-to-day basis, like Venmo and Cash App.
Fantastic. And you read my mind, Greg, because I was going to ask about the crypto assets and involvement with the gaming industry. So thank you for addressing that. Mike, do you have anything to add to where you see the industry heading and where it's come from?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of just putting together a wallet, first and foremost, you can't have an inferior wallet to your competitor. So you have to analyze what your competitors are doing, and make sure that you can match what they're doing. If they're approved with a payment method and they're operating in the same space that you are, you should be able to get the same approvals. Approvals aren't easy to get. To some of the points that we've made earlier, the US is still an immature market, especially when you compare it to Europe and Australia, where sports wagering has been going on for a long time. So the education process is still ongoing, but you can't have an inferior wallet. And so you have to have your major providers and payment methods present. And then, to Greg's point, it's providing alternative payment methods that are very easy to use and very cutting edge. Our demographic skews younger than the traditional kind of daily fantasy sports kind of version 1 is what we call it. And so, we feel that we launched Apple Pay via PaySafe. I don't know, when was it, Greg? End of last year, and we had immediate success with it. We're looking forward to adding Venmo here very shortly. We know that that's going to be an absolute success with us as well. So it's providing, I mean, I like to provide, if it were up to me, I would have as many payment methods as I could. But that's just not realistic from a resource standpoint. And, some payment methods are just unsuccessful. And so, you want to have as many as you can get and that you can have that users are where the adoption rate is going to be effective, without causing unnecessary overhead as it relates to engineering and resource and stretching your resources, adding payment methods that really have a poor adoption rate. Just to touch on the cryptocurrency thing, to Greg's point, I think that there could be a place for it in the US at some point, but again, it's an immature market, and this education with, you know, payment issuers, the Visas, the MasterCards, the Amexes of the world, as well as with regulators, that education process is still ongoing. In the United States, we're still becoming a more mature market. Um, and introducing something like a cryptocurrency into this at this point, I think is just premature and um, would invite more scrutiny than it would, than it would provide, positivity in terms of revenue. Um, the um, the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, as they say. So yeah, I think it's evolving. It's good to see. Especially over the last 10 years, the market has just become the education process has been effective, but it's still ongoing.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that. Now, to our viewers, if you have any further questions, please do drop them into the chat box. We have a few minutes left before the webinar ends. Now, before we end, I would like to just thank our speakers. We've had a really great thought-provoking session, and it's safe to say that risk, fraud, and compliance professionals within this industry are constantly being kept on their toes. Not only do they need to balance the risks around financial crime and understanding who their customer is and how they're using their products and playing, but they also need to ensure that they're actually enjoying the experience of playing, because that's what it's all about. And that partnership with payment service providers is absolutely crucial to share risk insights and data. And not just that, as Mike talked through, it's the importance of rules that are being built to monitor transactions. Now, we do have one final question that's come through. I'll see if we have time. I think we do have some quick time to run through it. So the question is, guys, and it's open to both of you, would crypto and Web3 transactions be part of the payment mix for fantasy sports in the future, and any plan to include this new technology? Well, you guys have kind of addressed this, not at the moment, but certainly in the future it might be considered because of the regulatory burden behind it. And I know, Mike, you did say that if it were up to you, you'd offer all sorts of crypto and other DeFi payment products. Now, I would like to thank all of you viewers for attending the webinar. If you do have any questions, you can contact the Payments Association at events@thepaymentsassociation.org. Now, for our viewers, if they'd like to contact you, Greg and Mike, how best can they reach out to you?
Greg, you can start.
Yeah, at least from the PaySafe side of things, I'll ask. I'll give our team. I'll ask our team to provide the Payments Association with an email that they can reach out to for questions that comes through our comms department. So after this, I'll follow up and I'll make sure that's provided to everyone that's attended to that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And Mike, yourself.
Yeah, I think it's the same. I'd love to give out my personal email, but I don't think that's a good idea. So we'll provide you with the appropriate contact information for our communications department as well.
Awesome, fantastic. Now, for all of you who viewed, we will be sending you a quick survey following the webinar, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete it, because it just means we can ensure that we're offering even better webinar sessions to you all. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a viewing of today's webinar if you would like to watch it at a later time. And on behalf of the Payments Association and to our speakers for joining us early morning hours from the States and Canada, thank you very much. And I wish you all a great rest of the day.
And thank you, Alia, for moderating. Appreciate it.